Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Today, I want to talk about a subject that I really have no stake in. In other words, I am a cisgender male, heterosexual. So that basically leaves me outside of the discussion. Nevertheless, I have enormous amounts of respect for people who are GSD. GSD stands for gender and sexual diversity. An alternate term is GSM, gender and sexual minorities, but I personally prefer GSD. Maybe I have no right to prefer one over the other since I'm outside of it, but so be it. It has never been an issue which has directly affected me because I am a cisgender heterosexual male. And yet it is one that I have always had a tremendous amount of compassion concerning because I've known people who fit into one or more of the categories implied by that statement, by that abbreviation, that I do feel a lot of empathy, a lot of sympathy, and a great deal of love and consideration toward people who are GSD or GSM. In the US and in much of the world, we refer to GSD or GSM by a much, I would say, clumsier abbreviation. And that is why I have these glasses on so I can read it. Otherwise, I might mess up and you'll see why. LGBTIAA. Okay. And some people would even add more. Some people I've seen actually add plus to that, and I don't know what the plus is. I guess it must be something. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual, and ally. The closest I can come is ally. I am an ally. I am somebody who is very much in alliance with people who belong to one or more of those categories. Now, I should point out that there are some people who object to that abbreviation because they feel as though they really don't belong in it. Let me take my glasses off since I really don't need them anymore. One example is intersex people. Intersex people are individuals who are born with certain types of, I guess you would call them birth defects, where they may have imperfectly or incompletely formed genitals, for example. So you may have somebody, for instance, who appears to be a woman, and yet she has testes, or a person who appears to be a man, and yet he has ovaries. Or you may have people with unusual genetic combinations like XXY and XYY. For that reason, they are generally called intersex because they are, I guess, somewhere in between the sexes, the biological sexes. Sex can be defined in different ways. Sex can be defined genetically. Sex can be defined based on tradition, for example. What is regarded as being a male or a female in one society, believe it or not, might not be regarded as a male or a female in another. And sex can also be defined hormonally based on the kinds of hormones which are produced. So that, again, there are all sorts of ways of defining sex. Similar thing is true with gender. In the US and in most Western countries, most countries of the world, in fact, we dualize gender, just as we tend to dualize sex. So gender is masculine or feminine. More recently, there has been a recognition that not everyone falls into those categories. So, for instance, there is a concept which was developed back in the 1970s, and this was one of the first acknowledgments that gender was not necessarily dual, which is why I'm bringing it up. The concept of psychological androgyny. Psychological androgyny is the concept that children should be raised as people, not as girls or as boys, meaning you should not assume, for example, that a child will necessarily like dolls because that child happens to be a girl, or that a boy will necessarily like, I don't know, construction sets because that child is a boy. So children should be exposed to all kinds of activities and be allowed to figure out which ones they like the best. So there is no assumption, no prejudice that a child will automatically form particular preferences based upon that child's gender. Is gender and sex the same? I had a student, a very right-wing student, very right-wing, who came up to me after class one time when I had just finished discussing the differences between sex and gender. And the student said to me, "Dr. Foster, you are mistaken. There is no difference between sex and gender." And here's the example that I gave. The strange thing is that after I gave the example, he did not comment at all. He didn't say a word. He simply turned around and left the room. It was very perplexing. I don't understand it. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he couldn't think of what to say. I have no idea. But he said nothing. In fact, he never spoke with me again during the rest of the semester. He stayed in the class, but he just didn't speak with me. Here's the example I gave. I said, okay, let me give you an illustration. Blank, blank, his name. Back when I was in elementary school, boys would talk a lot in school, even when they weren't supposed to. Boys were blabbermouths. Girls would generally keep quiet. They might whisper to each other, but they generally would not speak out loud. So if the teacher asked a question to the entire class, girls would usually not respond to the question unless the teacher addressed the question to a specific girl. In that case, the girl would respond interrogatively as a question, like, could it be this? I assume that their parents, most likely their mothers, told them nobody, I guess by nobody, she meant a boy or a man, Nobody likes a smart girl. Keep your mouth shut. Don't show off. Be quiet. So they did. Girls generally did not speak in class. And yet, when we had tests, it was an entirely different story. This was the day before confidentiality. Now you could not do this. But back in those days, back in the 1960s, when teachers were handing back tests, they would also announce the grade that the student got. That could get a teacher fired, or a professor fired for that matter, right now. But that was not the law back then. And I was always aware of what grades people were getting. It was obvious that girls did better than boys. Why? I will not speculate. I have no idea. I'll leave it at that. Girls almost always did better than boys. That's enough said. But they wouldn't show it. They wouldn't express it. They wouldn't speak their minds. They just kept their mouths shut, generally, if they could, during the entire class. Girls were not supposed to talk. Even adults. Now, this I did not see that much. I must have missed it by a generation. I know it once happened that when adults would gather together, the men would stay in the living room and the women would go into the kitchen. Again, I never saw that, but I understand that it used to be that way. Women and men were assumed to be really, really different. If not incompatible, at the very least, I would say completely so different from one another that there was no point in having a dialogue. It's kind of odd for me to think of that. But then again, when I recall what happened in elementary school, that seems very odd to me now, too. Again, gender was very fixed. And I pointed this out to the student. And I said, what about now? What do you see now? What have you seen as you have grown up? Have you seen that kind of thing that I described, that I saw firsthand with girls not talking in class? That is an issue of gender. Now, what that shows is two things. First, gender has changed, but sex has not. At least not as far as I know. As far as I know, sex is the same as it was back in the 1960s. But gender is not the same at all. It was at that point that the student turned around. I guess he knew he was defeated, and he walked outside the room. For some reason, I have noticed that there is a common obsession. I'll call it an obsession. That may not be technically accurate, but what the heck, I'll use that term. A common obsession with adhering to strict concepts of sex and gender. Notice how hostile a lot of conservatives are towards transgender people, trans women and trans men. There's a lot of hatred toward them. A feeling that somehow something is wrong, and that parents, if anything, should certainly not encourage it, should do everything in their power to discourage it. That is the state of gender and sex in the 21st century. Conservatives generally thinking in a very binary way. There is a strict concept of which sex you are in, and it's either male or female, and of which gender you are in, and it's either masculine or feminine. There is nothing in between those categories, at least nothing in between that is out of violation of God's will, I guess. So there you have it in terms of sex and gender. What that does is it creates a system of binaries, an attachment to binary opposites, where women are seen as the opposite of men, and masculine is seen as the opposite of feminine. That leaves a lot of people out. For example, trans women and trans men. Trans women who were born biologically male, but who know in their heads that they are biologically female, or that they are female. Leave the biologically out, who know in their heads that they are female. Now, some trans women, some trans men do eventually have various types of gender reassignment surgery, or at least make some kind of transition. Much of the ability to do that is limited by one's wealth. People who get really good surgery are generally wealthy people. If you are poor, you usually can't afford to do much. Maybe you take hormones. On the other hand, there are some trans women and some trans men who only want to take hormones. So there's a wide variety of different preferences when it comes to trans women and trans men. There are also a wide variety of preferences when it comes to heterosexual and homosexual. The intermediate category is referred to as bisexual, but some people refer to it as a sexual identity spectrum, that in reality, that we are all someplace along that spectrum. And so there have been arguments made, and I am not qualified to judge their validity, that's not my field, that we are all, to one extent or another, bisexual, meaning we are all somewhere in between being heterosexual and homosexual. And depending upon, I don't know what, hormones, genes, or whatever, that is how we identify ourselves. That is our sexual preference, our sexual orientation, or our sexual identity. Those are three terms for exactly the same thing, and they were coined in that chronological order. Today, the most common term is sexual identity. I will use whatever term people like. That's my policy. Whatever term people like, I will use. I have tremendous sympathy for anybody who is trapped in the middle, for anybody who is bisexual, for anybody who is intersex, who doesn't fall into the male or female sexes exactly. I would imagine that they have difficult lives. Do I know that? Not firsthand. And as far as I know anyway, I have never known any intersex people. However, most intersex people identify with being female or male, even if they have no corrective surgery, and they live their lives as one or the other. there have been some interesting cases. For example, there was one case of a man, a baby, I should say, a baby boy, who was being given a circumcision, and a bit too much was taken off during the circumcision. You get what I mean. So a decision was made to take off the rest of it and to raise that child as a girl. Later in life, as a teenager, now this child had never been told this story, but the child began to think of herself as himself. And the child could not figure out why. Now, eventually, the child was told. And then there had to be accommodations. The child went from being raised as a girl to being raised as a boy. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. But what that shows is that there certainly is a biological component of sexual behavior, just as there is a sociological component, which is generally called socialization or gender. So both are important. Where do you draw the line? Hard to say, because when a baby is born, that baby is born generally a girl or a boy. A girl is raised feminine. A boy is raised masculine. So how do you know whether the characteristics that that child is developing are a result of biology or sociology, or in old terms, nurture or nature or nurture? There's really no way to know. And so the dividing line between sex and gender is still very much a mystery. But let's get to the heart of what I wanted to discuss today. And that is the oppression of those who are caught in between. By caught in between, I mean bisexuals, I mean trans women, trans men, and I mean people who are intersex. They are all people who are caught in between. They are living in a society, perhaps you could say in a world, which values duality and has an intolerance for binary categories related to gender or sex. And so I don't know what you would call that, but it is certainly a type of oppression or domination based on a fixation on binary opposites. Certainly, people who define themselves as bisexual don't fit into the conventional definition of homosexual or heterosexual. People who are intersex don't fit into the conventional definition of female or male, and neither, for that matter, do people who are transgender. So you have a lot of categories with people who basically don't fit into either of the two major categories which exist in various societies. It would be nice, and I think it would resolve the problem if we simply stopped putting rigid labels on people We let people be what they are. So if somebody is a trans woman, if somebody is a trans man, that we accept that person as such. We don't question it. We don't challenge it. We don't try to change the person to fit into one category or another of our liking. We let that person choose her or his own category. Same thing is true with bisexuals. They don't fit into the conventional categories of heterosexual, homosexual. And so what? I mean, the concept of heterosexuality is new. Surprisingly, it is new. Because in the past, people that today we call heterosexual, in the past were simply called people. People, right? Just ordinary people. There was no need for a label like heterosexual. But then all of a sudden, homosexuality, gays and lesbians, began in the 60s and especially the 70s to become more socially acceptable. And today, of course, in many countries of the world, including right here in the US, at least for now, it's a worry that I have all the time, but that might change. People of the same sex can marry one another. Okay? My view is any adults should be able to marry one another. There should be no restrictions at all, as long as they are adults. So if you want to have 2 women married to 1 man, 3 men married to 1 woman, or whatever, who cares? So basically, you could have polygyny, a man with at least 2 wives, polyandry, a woman with at least 2 husbands, and many other combinations. If you introduce 2 women married to 3 or more men, or some other combination like that. So I see no reason why we shouldn't allow people to do whatever they want. I mean, why not? What is the point of imposing those kinds of restrictions on people? So if we accept bisexuality, if we accept trans women and trans men, if we accept people who are intersex, then why worry about it? I will give you my view with some hesitation, because I realize that it is not a view which is shared by all intersex people. And I am not intersex, so I really am not qualified to give a view. I have no experience living as an intersex person. But the fact that intersex people are forced, in effect, by society to choose whether to be boys or girls, or men or women, I think shows that same addictiveness, for lack of a better term, to this notion of binaries. Why not simply define people as who they are? Why worry about having them fit into conventional categories of sex? That is my view about intersex. There you have it. Feel free to disagree with me. I imagine many people will, but that's how I feel. My view about this subject is extremely open. I believe that people should be allowed to be whatever they want to be. Well, as long as they are not hurting anybody else and especially as long as they are not hurting children. But adults, yeah, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with it? What's wrong with encouraging it? Or even with children? If a child says to her or his parent, look, I realize I'm a boy, but I believe that I am a girl. Why is it a bad thing to give that child hormone blockers? I mean, hormone blockers are not permanent. If when that child reaches the age of majority, say 18 or so, that child or adult at that point can be free to change her or his mind and say, well, I still feel that way. I still feel like I am the other sex. Or no, I feel like I am actually the sex I was born into. Whatever. Why have that kind of rigidity? That is what bothers me. So I guess what I am arguing for in this podcast is a much more open attitude towards sex and gender, and a rejection of any type of rigidity. If somebody wants to be a trans woman, fine. If somebody wants to be a trans man, fine. If somebody wants to be both a woman and a man, fine. If somebody wants to be a man or a woman, fine. I see no reason why any choices should be excluded. What's the justification for it? People should be free to explore who they are and to make their own decisions. The problem is, again, it's this addiction to binaries, to opposites. This feeling that somehow things need to fall into opposing categories. And I can only think, why? What is the reason for it? Why do things need to fall into opposing categories? It makes no sense to me. And I say that as a heterosexual, cisgender male, someone who has never had to deal with any of those issues, but someone who was an ally of people of any type of sexuality or gender, and who believes it should be that person's choice, not my choice, and certainly not the choice of the right wing in the US, for example, to make those choices for them. Why shouldn't somebody be allowed to change their sex on their birth certificate? Why should a person have to even go to court to do it? Why shouldn't it just be an automatic process? You go to court and change your sex. That's it. No one should be able to challenge it. So I guess that is the reason why I like the British term GSD, gender and sexual diversity. It eliminates the need to constantly add new letters. And it emphasizes the fact that although I may not be a part of one of the minority categories, like in LGBT, IAA, whatever, I am a part of GSD in that sense. I am one of the diverse people who make up gender and sex. And so we are all, in that sense, a part of gender and sexual diversity, even though generally that term has not been applied to people like me. It's been applied to people who are sexual minorities and gender minorities. Either way, I don't care. It's not going to be the end of my life either way. People can think of me any way they like. if people want to say you are just as diverse as I am, I say being a homosexual or a trans woman or a trans man or an intersex person, that's fine. I don't care. To me, caring about something as stupid as that is at the very least a sign of tremendous insecurity. So, what's the point of worrying about that? We have so many things in the world that merit our attention. I can't get Gaza out of my mind. And I mean literally. I tried. I tried to stop forgetting Gaza for a day or even a moment. And I can't. Even as I was talking about this subject, Gaza was still in the back of my mind. So that is a serious problem. And the fact that our media around the world are not giving Gaza equal consideration to other stories. CNN, for example, has agreed to submit all of its stories on the war. If you want to call it a war, a terrorist act, to Israeli censors. Gee, I thought that's what happened in fascist countries. Ah, Israel is a fascist country. That explains it. So again, that's just one of the many pressing problems that we have. Climate change, another pressing problem. Things that can't wait. These kinds of things can be resolved like that in an instant. It is simply a matter of opening our minds and accepting the diversity which is all around us. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.